In the first part of this unit, we had studied microscopes because they're an important part of learning about cells. So now we're moving into the actual material where we're going to talk about cells, what they are, and the parts that they're made out of. So these are all images of cells, all of which you're going to see in our cells lab, which we'll be doing next week probably. We're going to look at different types of plant cells and animal cells. So what you're seeing here are individual cells from various types of organs. So to start though, and we talked about this in our question of the day, first of all, what is a cell? We talked about it when we were talking about the characteristics of life. So what exactly is a cell, Nicholas?
It's like this little thing that kind of looks up.
Yeah, it's our small microscopic parts that make up all living things. We call cells the basic unit of life because, as we know, all living things are made of cells. From tiny little single-celled organisms up to huge complex organisms made of trillions of cells. As we talked about in our question of the day, it wasn't until the 1600s really that cells were really started to be studied. And as you guys said, because microscopes hadn't really been invented yet. During the middle and late 1600s is when people started to actually create microscopes which could magnify an image. Do you know what the important piece that wasn't developed until that time? Kendall?
Here?
No? What's the most important part of a microscope?
You like the eyepiece or the like.
Yeah, what do we call those? They are
Lenses.
lenses. Glass lenses were the important breakthrough when people learned how to shape glass in a way which could do certain things to an image, a magnifying image. Robert Hooke was the first scientist to actually see cells. James?
On the second one, it looks, it's not the slime one. It looks kind of like a
What's that?
It looks kind of like two donuts.
Oh yeah, there's a few differences, yeah, in these two sides, okay. So Robert Hooke was the first to actually see cells. These are drawings that Robert Hooke made from his observations. And Robert Hooke was observing this. Pass these around. He made a very thin section of this and looked at it under the microscope. What is this?
Cork.
Yeah, this is cork.
The cork.
So where does cork come from? It's wood. It's from the bark of trees. Cork is, this is a cork board. It's made of this wood, this material. A cork which goes in a wine bottle. It's made of this, a natural cork. And it's a type of wood. And what you're holding as we pass that around, that is sort of the remains of the bark of a tree. And that's made of cells. And Hooke made slides, made sections of that and looked at it in the microscope. And this is what he saw. And what he thought was those little circles, those little boxes that he saw when he looked at cork, he thought that they looked like the cells in a monastery where monks, religious people live. These small little square rooms. And so he called those little square boxes that he was seeing cells, giving them the name cell. But what you're holding, those chunks of cork that I'm passing around, are these alive? Not anymore. No, this is just sort of like the remains. This is like the dead parts of the bark of the tree. And that's what Hooke saw. So they weren't actually living cells. It was Anton van Leeuwenhoek was the first person to observe living cells. And Leeuwenhoek developed new ways of making very good lenses. And in 1675, he used these lenses to observe many, many types of living cells. He made careful drawings of all these things that he looked at under his microscopes. And he saw living cells in pond water, in blood, in sperm. He saw all these, that these have living cells in them. Tiny little things that were unable to be seen without a microscope. but we're able to be seen with the microscope. If anyone used Google yesterday, you may have noticed that the Google logo, as they often do, they change it to different things. And yesterday it was changed, and it was changed actually in honor of Anton van Leeuwenhoek.
Wait, I didn't get to finish.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, did you know what it was? Did you click on it? So it was, yesterday was Leeuwenhoek's birthday. Okay, he was born on October 24th, 1632. This was the Google logo from the other day, and you can see this is Leeuwenhoek. His microscopes were not really things you might think of. This is what Leeuwenhoek's microscopes actually looked like. And what they had was a tiny little lens built into this very, very small hole. At the top was a needle where he would place the sample of what he was looking at and then peer through that hole at that image. It can be focused and moved a little bit with these knobs. And it was just a single lens. It wasn't a compound microscope. But these lenses, he really did a great job creating these lenses. They can magnify the image up to 300 times just with this single lens. It's quite remarkable. In fact, it wasn't really until recently people were able to figure out how he made these. He kept it a secret how he created these lenses. He didn't allow anyone else to look at how he made them. And so he sort of had an advantage over other scientists because he knew how to create these very strong lenses. So as scientists started to study cells, they began to learn more and more about them. And the sort of main theories about cells we kind of put together, we call this the cell theory. There's 3 parts to it, and you should know these 3 parts. And it's kind of sort of common sense probably. Cell theory has 3 statements that go along with it. First off, all living things are made of cells. Anything that is alive is composed of these individual cells. Also, cell theory states that cells are the smallest form of life. What are the smallest living things?
Ant.
People always say ants, but much smaller than ants.
Dust.
Know? Bacteria. Tiny little single-celled living things that are made of just one very, very small cell. So some things are just a single cell. The last part of cell theory is about where cells come from, and you guys already know this. Where do cells come from?
Other living things.
Other cells. Cells can reproduce. Cells can divide and copy themselves. And so when we put these 3 ideas together, that's what we call the cell theory.
So if cells can only come from cells, then how was their first cell?
It's kind of like chicken and the egg kind of thing. Yeah. Scientists believe the first cells came from in the very, very early Earth, in the oceans. There was different conditions than exist right now, and a mixture of energy from lightning along with these chemicals somehow were formed sort of the precursors of living cells, membranes and things like that, that then became the first things that were basically like similar to bacteria were the very first types of living things. That's a good question. So cells are these small subunits, and inside of them they actually have parts we call organelles. Now what word does that look like? Organ, yeah. How about organ? Well, give me an example. What is an organ from the human body? Abby?
Your heart.
Your heart. Emma? Your skin, your lungs, your liver. Those are organs. They are a part of us, and each organ has a certain job that it does to keep us alive. Well, the same sort of thing is true in cells. Within a single cell, there's a bunch of smaller parts. And each of these smaller parts has a job to do to allow the cell to function. So these small things, we call them organelles. They're parts within a cell that have a special job and a certain function. And we're going to be spending the rest of today describing some of those organelles, these parts that are within a cell. Talk about what they look like, what they do. Because there's a whole list of cell organelles that you're going to need to know about. And I know that cells are new. Most people have been saying they never studied cells in elementary school. Well, so there'll be a lot of new information here in the rest of the class. So there's lots of types of cells. We simplify things and kind of categorize into two groups, plant cells and animal cells. That's simplified a little bit, but for our purposes, that'll be okay. One of these cells that you see up there is a plant cell, like a generic plant cell, and one is a generic animal cell. Anyone have any idea which is which? And have like a reason? It's not just guessing, but anyone tell which is Tatum?
The one on the left, I think is the
What?
plant cell because it's green.
Okay, good point.
Like a seed thing in the
The
middle.
one on the left is a plant cell, you're correct. And the fact that it's green is one thing that might give you a clue. Because plant cells have a certain organelle which makes them green. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The other thing that can tell you is the shape. Plant cells are generally kind of squarish, rectangular, box-shaped, sort of. Whereas animal cells are roundish or sort of an irregular shape. And so this is the animal cell, and this is the plant cell. So for some of the organelles that we talk about, they will be found in both plant and animal cells. Other organelles might only be found in plant cells. There's some specialized organelles. And we'll start with the first one, which is only found in plant cells. Now I say we're simplifying because it also is found in fungi and bacteria, but for our purposes we're saying it's found in plant cells only. And it's the cell wall. The cell wall is the outermost layer of a plant cell. And it's made of a material called cellulose. Cellulose is a tough material. It's a large molecule, which is just found in plant cells. And it makes up this sort of hard, you could think of it sort of as a shell around the plant cell. It's a very outer layer. And it helps to give the plant cell its shape and protect the interior. But an important point about the cell wall is it's not really living. It's this shell of material that once it's formed, okay, it's not alive. So when I passed around those pieces of cork earlier, what you're holding on to are all the remaining cell walls that those plant cells had around them. And when Robert Hooke was looking at his microscope, those boxes he saw, he was looking at the cell walls. If I go back here and look at this again, this is way back there. Okay, these boxes, what he is looking at here, this is all the cell wall, the remains of those cells. All right, so there's a cell wall, but again, only in plant cells. The next layer, the next organelle, is called the cell membrane. Now, do you know what a membrane is? What does that word mean? A membrane. Kendall?
I think that it's like the very inside of it.
Not quite the very inside. Membrane is like a very thin material, a thin, flexible material. And the cell membrane, in the animal cell, it's the outermost layer. In the plant cell, it has a cell membrane, but it's inside of the cell wall. And the cell wall is just sort of the shell. Inside of that, there's another layer that's the cell membrane. And the cell membrane is a really important organelle, really important part of the cell. The cell membrane is what can determine which things can enter and leave the cell. And that's important. Cells need to take in certain materials and let out certain materials, and other things not let in and not let out. Now, a question that's often asked that people get wrong is the question, what is the outermost living layer of a plant cell? What is the answer to that question? The outermost living layer of a plant cell. Tatum? What part is it called? James? No. What is the outermost living layer of a plant cell?
I don't know what it's called.
We've already talked about it. Kendall?
Cell membrane.
Okay, that is correct. But why is that a tricky question, Kendall?
Because the cell wall is more alive than dead cell.
Yeah, because the cell wall was actually the outermost layer, but it's not alive. So when I say the outermost living layer, it's the cell membrane. All right, so the cell membrane and cell wall defines the outer part of the cell. The inside of the cell is filled up with lots of different things. These are organelles that we're going to be talking about. But the space in between those organelles, the stuff that's in blue in the animal cell and it's light green in the plant cell, that other stuff, it's almost like a gel that holds everything in place. It's called the cytoplasm. Cyto means cell. Plasm kind of means like goo. Anyone watch Ghostbusters?
Me.
Does that sound familiar? Where have you heard plasma in Ghostbusters? Ectoplasm. Stuff the ghosts shoot out. So the cytoplasm basically fills up the cell. It's kind of like, have you ever had that like Jello stuff with like chunks of fruit stuck in it in different spots? It's kind of like that sort of where, you know, the Jello part is the cytoplasm and all the chunks stuck throughout there are kind of like the organelles. Here's an actual microscope picture of two cells, animal cells. So you see the outer layers, the cell membrane, and the white part would be where the cytoplasm is. Those dots are an organelle we're going to talk about next. Those darker dots in the middle, those are the nucleus.
Do the cells change, like the look of them change when the plant is dying?
Yeah, they can change and the organelles move around and we'll talk about, yeah, they do. Sometimes certain organelles die or are not used anymore. There are a lot of changes that can happen. Good question. One of the largest organelles that's found in the cell, often towards the center of the cell, here in this cell that's been cut in half, you see this purple little ball. That's an organelle called the nucleus. It's pretty large. And the nucleus is really important. It basically directs how the cell works. Because there's something very important stored inside of the nucleus. Does anybody know what it is? What's inside of the nucleus that's so important? No? I mean, sometimes people call it the brain of the cell. But cells don't really think, so I don't love that description, but something else inside the nucleus. It's what makes you who you are. It's what determines exactly what you look like. What is in there?
Your DNA.
Your DNA, exactly. Your DNA is found in the nucleus of all of your cells. It's found in these objects called the chromosomes. All right, but the outer layer of the nucleus, it's sort of like a ball inside of the cell. The outer layer of it is its own membrane. It's called the nuclear membrane. And it separates the nucleus from the other parts of the cell. And it has these small little holes in it, which allow certain things in and out of the nucleus. Hello? Okay. Yeah. So the nucleus is surrounded by this membrane, which allows some things to go in and out. And then within the nucleus are these structures. Abby just said it, DNA. Okay? They're found in this material called your chromosomes. They look like an X sometimes. That's what this is, showing a chromosome. It's made of DNA. And as you know, DNA is what makes you who you are. It's why you look the way you do. It's why your body functions the way it does, is because of the instructions coded for in your DNA. Does anyone know how many chromosomes there are in a normal, healthy human body cell? Nicholas? Close. He said 23. It's actually,
32?
no. If you double that, it's 46. 23 of them come from, where did you get 23 of your chromosomes? Yes. And the other 23?
Yeah.
Yes. We inherit 23 chromosomes from each parent. And that's why we have a mixture of traits from each parent, because we get half of our chromosomes from our mother and half from our father. And so those chromosomes are in all of our cells, inside of the nucleus. And they determine how our body works, how it functions. Finally, the last part within the nucleus is this dark area here, shown here. It's called the nucleolus. It means little nucleus, and it actually makes in that nucleolus another cell structure we're going to talk about called the ribosome. Hello?
For the chromosomes, isn't it like, if you have Down syndrome, isn't it because you have 45 chromosomes?
No, 47.
Oh, yeah, actually.
So sometimes, yeah, we'll talk about that when we talk about genetics. So sometimes a person can be born with one extra 21st chromosome, and that's what leads to what we call Down syndrome.
Wait then.
We'll talk about that, about all this when we talk about reproduction. All right, so those are some organelles. Let's talk about some more. Another organelle within a cell is called the endoplasmic reticulum. Kind of a mouthful. We often abbreviate it ER, endoplasmic reticulum. The ER is found in the cell, and it's a whole series of membranes, kind of like tubes that wind around, often located right near the nucleus. And this system of tubes helps to transport things and move them around within the cell. Now you're going to have to remember what these organelles do and what they look like. So I like to sometimes give you hints to help. The hint that I like to give to remember is what the ER does is if you get injured, you have to be transported to the ER, the emergency room. So if you can remember that phrase, be transported to the ER. The endoplasmic reticulum, its function is to transport things. There's actually two varieties of ER. There's rough ER, which has all these little dots on it, kind of like chocolate chip cookies, all these chocolate chips on it. And there's smooth ER, which doesn't have it. Okay. Here in this microscope image, you have rough ER, because on this system of membranes, you have these little dots. Those dots are actually this cell structure called the ribosome, these tiny little things. And their job is to make proteins. Some of them are like stuck to the ER, like those you see here, and others are kind of floating around free in the cytoplasm. A hint to remember ribosomes. First three letters form what word? Rib. Anyone like to eat ribs? You need
Never
to
had
kind of
one.
gross, right? No one likes ribs? I know, I'm good.
You don't eat red.
What's a rib made out of? Meat. What nutrient is in meat mostly? Protein. So if you remember, ribosomes, ribs are made of protein. Ribosome's job in the cell is to make protein. Sometimes, or there's protein in vegetables too. Yeah. I eat fake Morningstar riblets made of like tofu, made of like vegetable protein.
Okay,
They have like barbecue sauce on them. They look like little mini
breakfast?
ribs. Not for breakfast, just
Oh,
for
I think
dinner.
said breakfast.
My family's like really I like one of those. Golgi bodies is the next organelle. The Golgi bodies are interesting. They package up proteins and then get them ready to be shipped out of the cell. They're kind of like the post office of the cell. Anyone ever hear of the band Fish?
Yes.
Yeah?
That's all my sixth grade teacher
Who's your sixth grade teacher?
Yes.
Oh yeah? That's all she talked about? Well anyway, the band Fish has a song, and in the song they mention several cell organelles, one of which is the Golgi body. Someday I'll let you listen to that song. Probably won't like it. So the Golgi bodies, I say that they look like a stack of pancakes with little drops of syrup. I like to compare a lot of things to food, I'm just realizing that. But anyway, the Golgi bodies look like this stack of membranes. And these are the delicious little drops of maple syrup in pancakes. Because what happens is proteins are made by the ribosomes. They get sent to the Golgi bodies, to these membranes, where those proteins get packaged into a little bubble, which then can exit the cell. So those are the Golgi bodies. Vacuoles. Vacuoles are organelles that are for storage. They store material. And plants usually have a very large central vacuole. Animal cells usually have a small vacuoles within them. So in these diagrams, the vacuoles, it's this big thing, kind of looks like an ice cube in this plant cell. And the animal cell, they're just small little circles. And they store food, they store water, store waste. Another organelle that looks just like a vacuole is a lysosome. Oh, these are one more picture. This is the large vacuole. All this stuff you see in gray is actually the vacuole in this plant cell. It gets filled up with water and gives the plant its structure and holds it upright. So the lysosomes are small little, sort of like vacuoles, but inside of them they have these enzymes, digestive enzymes, that break down things. And so, for example, if an organelle is no longer working and needs to be sort of destroyed and recycled, the lysosomes will release some of this enzyme to destroy it. White blood cells have lysosomes in them so that when they're trying to destroy a pathogen in your body, the lysosomes release these enzymes and break it down. Two last organelles to talk about, the mitochondria and the chloroplast. These are both related to energy. Mitochondria is the organelle that actually gives the cell the energy it needs to stay alive, the energy it needs to function. Often we call it the powerhouse of the cell, or the mighty mitochondria, because they supply energy. It looks like a jelly bean with a bunch of folds inside of it. That's a mitochondria. Jelly bean with folds. Because all cells, in order to stay alive, they need energy. And it's the mitochondria that supplies them with that energy. And our final organelle is the chloroplast. Chloroplasts are found in plant cells only. This is another microscope image of the mitochondria. Now, what are plants able to do that other organisms are not able to do? Abby?
Well,
No, other things can grow.
reproduce.
Other things can reproduce. What can plants do that other organisms cannot? Zach?
Like take the sun.
Yeah, make their own food using the sun's energy. They do that because they have this organelle, chloroplast. Chloroplasts are green structures. They have a pigment in them that makes them green. It's called chlorophyll. And this is why leaves are green, because the cells within a leaf have lots of chloroplasts. And chloroplasts are able to capture light from the sun. They need some other things, but we'll talk about that eventually. And they use that to make food for the plant in the form of glucose or sugar. That's why plants don't need to eat anything, because they're able to make their own food using sunlight and their chloroplast. This process is called photosynthesis. So these cells are green because they contain chloroplast. If you look under a higher magnification, each of these cells has dozens of these small green dots in there. Those are the chloroplasts. They allow the plant to make its own food. So you're going to have to learn about what these organelles do and be able to label them. Okay, so what we're going to do on Thursday in class is work on some drawings. You're going to be making your own drawings of these plant and animal cells. If you have colored pencils, you might want to bring them because you're going to have to make colored drawings of these cells. Not till next week sometime. We also have a lab to do next week.